47 participants now. Okay. No worries. Look, why don't we get underway? So please allow me to introduce Ravita, Dr. Ravita Prasad, who from National University, Fiji.
Thank you. What did you do? You have to show me.
Call over internet.
Oh.
Okay, so please do mute your microphones unless you're hoping to be heard. Okay, we are getting some background noise there. Ravita, you online?
Yes, yes.
Please, let me hand over to you. Let's get underway.
Okay. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third and final day of the workshop series on a workshop on strengthening partnerships for energy security and resilience in the Pacific. Our focus today will be on low carbon land transport. And low carbon land transport was one of the outcomes of workshops held earlier this year. And I personally think land transport sector is something that needs urgent attention, as it is linked to the power generation if we move when we move towards e-mobility. And also we need enabling policies and infrastructure for moving towards low carbon transport. So our agenda for today, Ian, if you could write. Agenda for today is shown on the screen. And the first session will discuss about e-mobility options and the current dependencies on diesel and petrol. There would be discussions on policy implications and implications on fuel import if we move towards e-mobility. So now, without taking much time, let me introduce Mr. Solomone Fifita, who would be giving the opening remarks. Mr. Solomone Fifita is an alumni of University of the South Pacific, University of Pennsylvania, USA, and the Asian Institute of Technology, Bangkok. He is the former energy planner for the Kingdom of Tonga. He's also been the former Deputy Director for Energy at SPC. He's the lead author, he has the lead author roles for the IPCC and the lead reviewer for the UNFCCC. And currently he's the manager of PICRI, Pacific Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Solomone Fifita to give his opening remarks. Mr. Fifita, the floor is yours.
Excuse me, Mone, we can't hear you. You're probably on mute.
Yeah, and not surprisingly, in energy mitigation roadmaps, investment plans, NDCs, there are expressions to the effect that countries are working towards a more efficient, safe, and low carbon transport sector. I can't move my slides.
Yeah, they're moving now.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we have learned from COVID-19 is that there are non-transport low carbon options, such as working, meeting, like what we're doing now, and studying and praying virtually. And I think that we can imagine the amount of fuel saved from these virtual meetings and working from home. And more we are seeing people doing business electronically. No doubt people are just settling their bills from home, no need to travel. And of course, in some places, curfew are imposed such that by a certain time, there's no non-essential travels. On the other hand, there are the low carbon land transport options, including non-motorized transport, walking and cycling, efforts to cut down on the distance and the time of travels, bridges, roundabouts, etc. There are efforts to promote more efficient vehicles, smaller cars, and restrictions on the age of imported second-hand cars to the region. And of course, electric vehicles by way of hybrid vehicles, as well as battery electric vehicles. So here we are essentially replacing, putting in fossil fuel by putting in electricity. And in a region where there are ambitious renewable energy targets, it does make sense that the electrification of the transport sector be considered as part and parcel of the pursuit of the region's renewable energy target. I have two messages in here. One is that the promotion of electric vehicles should be carried out jointly with the pursuit of the country's renewable energy target. We don't want to promote electric vehicles at the expense of increasing diesel generation in order to charge our vehicles. Secondly, promotion of electric vehicles cannot be done in isolation from the power utilities. And I think we heard this on Thursday. It's one of the emerging challenges for the power utilities in terms of looking towards meeting the demand for transport charging. There's a lot happening already on electric vehicles in the region. Cook Islands have got a public charging station already. There are about 80 electric vehicles on the streets of Rarotonga. Various efforts have been tried in Fiji, and some people will talk more detail about this. In Samoa, the private sector are importing and selling second-hand electric cars. The power utility itself has tendered for the supply of electric vehicles as well as charging stations. In Tonga, they were surprised to find that there are already electric cars on their streets. In 2006, solar tuk-tuks were assembled in Tonga. It's reported that the premier of Niue goes to work on an e-bike. And in Tuvalu, for one of their projects with the World Bank, they have tendered for the supply of 1,000 e-scooters to be tried in Tuvalu. So, not surprisingly, the Energy and Transport Ministers meeting of 2019 directed SPC to develop a regional e-mobility program to address barriers to e-mobility. Some reports were produced through this exercise and they are available online. But the barrier identified through the study conducted by SPC, it's to do with the newness of the technology. It's something new, but which the region are not prepared fully for it yet in terms of structures, in terms of policies, guidelines, safety, awareness, even the technical capability for the maintenance of the EVs. And so as this SPC through the PICRI has come up with a regional e-mobility readiness program to provide support to member countries to better prepare them for their respective mobility futures. And the program are in the 4 broad areas in terms of policies, guidelines, awareness and promotion, as well as demonstration and upscale. And through this regional program, a feasibility study on low emission land transport is currently underway in Vanuatu, identifying the barriers, how it could be addressed, and packaging this into a GCF funding concept. Similar study is being conducted in the Solomon Islands too. And we are currently discussing demonstration projects in the Cook Islands, Tonga, as well as in Vanuatu. And we are looking forward to a joint awareness program at Savai'i, Samoa, 3rd week of October. The awareness program has a special focus on the e-mobility. And I'm aware of this study of national policy for deploying and scaling up e-mobility in Papua New Guinea that is being supported by the CDCN. So in conclusion, I just want to say that PICs should be fully informed and prepared with the necessary policies, legislations, and structures in place before a nationwide uptake of electric vehicles. I think that's what I want to say here in terms of setting the scene for this session. I'm now pleased to move on and introduce the next group of presenters. There are 4 of them, and we have 45 minutes approximately. So I'll ask the presenters to have about 8 or 9 minutes each, giving us some time at the end to have some Q&A. Our first presenter is by Ian McGill. Ian is an associate professor of the School of Electrical Engineering and Telecommunications and joint director, collaboration on energy and environmental markets. He leads research in sustainable energy transformation and distributed energy systems. And Ian will talk to us about worldwide experiences and perspectives on mobility and energy resilience, mobility technologies, energy and emissions implications, and its role in decarbonization. Over to you, Ian. Thank you.
Okay, look, thank you so much, Solomon, for a fantastic introduction to the workshop and what we're looking to achieve. I'm going to just spend 7 minutes or so stepping back out to the bigger picture of sustainable transport and mobility. And the first point really is in a global sense, not just a regional sense. Land transport is some of the key unfinished business in achieving secure, clean, low carbon energy transition. And if we look down here, final energy consumption by sector, we see that transport is now basically the largest sector in terms of energy consumption. But you can also see it's the fastest and most continually growing as well. So it's extremely dependent on oil, as we can see here. The other thing is if we look at the breakdown of those transport transport energy use and the emissions associated with it, we can see up here that rail, 2- and 3-wheelers, light commercial, passenger cars, light commercial, buses, medium and heavy trucks is the great proportion of emissions associated with transport. I mean, maritime and aviation are also important, but land transport's the really key one. So a secure, clean, low carbon energy future is one where transport has to be radically changed. Firstly, just to pick up on a point that Solomon made, the first thing, I guess the first opportunity for progress here is there's a growing appreciation that we don't have a transport problem, we have a mobility challenge. So what's the difference? Well, transport's moving goods and people around, but mobility is, you can see the word ability in there. It's the ability to move freely or to not, to attend university or classes or workshops or church remotely with much lower associated transport, but you still have the ability to do what you want to do. So we're seeing a great reframing of a transport problem to a mobility challenge. A big part of this obviously is behavioural more broadly as well, even when you are travelling. How much are you travelling and how are you travelling? We have many opportunities to improve our conventional transport options. Fuel efficiency is clearly very critical in that, but there's also a range of biofuels that can be used in conventional vehicles. And then there's e-mobility, which we are going to talk about quite a bit. There's 2 to 3 wheelers. Electric bikes are actually incredible growth industry at the moment. Electric scooters, electric motorbikes, 3-wheelers, rickshaws, light vehicles, cars, light commercial vehicles, and then heavy vehicles, probably the more challenging one sector to electrify. So we have plenty of opportunities. How are we going so far? Well, it's pretty challenging, really. If we look globally, bicycle use, it's not very well monitored. We don't have great data on it, but it represents a fairly small proportion of trips, certainly in so-called developed country cities. Biofuel production has sort of been growing. It's very US ethanol and Brazil ethanol dominated with mandates there. We have a very small proportion of the vehicle fleet currently electric vehicles, some light duty vehicles, much higher with 2 to 3 wheelers. That's very much China, but also Vietnam and some other major markets. And then fuel efficiency is improving, but not greatly. And in some ways, cars are getting more efficient, but people are buying bigger cars and sports utility vehicles. So it's challenging. Recent trends, reasonably promising, I think, and they vary quite a lot. Cycling has really taken off with the pandemic in many cities around the world. Sometimes it's associated with people not using public transport. Sometimes it's associated with people not using cars. We are seeing electric vehicle market growing extremely rapidly. And we can see that there are some markets now, there's a lot of detail on this slide. You'll have the slide so you can go back and look at it. But we can see there are some markets now where, 10, 20%, well, I think some countries like Norway, considerably greater than that, of new vehicle sales are now electric vehicles. So we really appear to be at a transition point in the electric vehicle space. So look, there's some promising trends. However, we have an enormous way to go if we are seeking to achieve clean mobility. Now, you may think that the world will get its act together and achieve net zero emissions 2050, or you may be fairly sure in your own mind that it won't. But if it is going to do that, we have enormous emission reductions that we have to achieve, and transport has a really key role in those. And part of that is behaviour and avoided demand. Part of that is around efficiency. But a very big part around it is electric vehicles and transport biofuels. We really need, according to the International Energy Agency work on net zero emissions, to really basically electrify our entire light duty vehicle, even heavy trucks and 2 to 3 wheeler fleets in a matter of decades, as well as implementing behavioural change. People have less cars, people use shared services, more cycling, more walking. Andrew's going to be speaking more on this. Now, one thing that happens with sustainable mobility is it links very closely to other sectors. So electric vehicles link very closely to our power systems. And Solomon made the point about don't just add electric vehicles without cleaning up as well as expanding the electric power systems that we have. So there's an enormous amount of money to be spent globally and clearly regionally in cleaning up and expanding electricity at the same time that we are deploying electric vehicles, because they will be responsible for a significant amount of additional demand. So there's an awful lot of money to be spent. Policy and regulatory needs is a really interesting question. There are a growing number of transport and transport-related policies around fuel efficiency, incentives, charges, EV charges and deployment. We've got a growing number of countries and cities announcing that they are going to ban internal combustion engines. But also we do have significant challenges out there in bringing EVs through as well. When you ask people who want to deploy EVs, lack of charging, lack of EV types, capital costs, operational change, uncertainties in the landscape and so on. A particular question is, do we need policies and so on to drive electric vehicle uptake, or is there a chance that electric vehicle uptake's going to happen as they become an increasingly attractive alternative to conventional vehicles? And then we've got our work cut out to actually build the infrastructure, the networks and the generation to actually help meet those. And that's a really interesting challenge. We also need to integrate across what were traditionally largely separated policy and planning processes. And for my last slide, I just want to summarize. Obviously, I won't read out the World Bank's note on this, but I do want to pick out some points they make, which I think is really important. They say the transport has been neglected when we're thinking about secure, low carbon futures. And in part, that's because it hasn't, in some ways, got its act together in talking with all of the other sectors. So that might be a reason it wasn't explicitly in the Sustainable Development Goals as such. It's clearly part of a number of them. It's incredibly important for achieving all of our wider goals. And improving the transport sector has the potential to improve lives and livelihoods enormously for many, many people. But currently we are actually heading in the wrong direction. And so our challenge is not just, we've got to first reverse the adverse trends and then look to improve. So I'll end there. And, obviously very happy to have comments, questions in the chat, and we may get a chance to pick them up later. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. That's a global perspective and the global experiences on the sustainable mobility. We will now try to bring it further down to the regional level, and I'm pleased to introduce to you Eduardo Santagata, who is a PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales under the School of Photovoltaic and Renewable Energy Engineering. He's researching the broader space of resilience in the energy nexus with an emphasis on decarbonization and innovation in PICDs. Eduardo will speak on the regional status of land transport fuel use, cost, and emissions across the PICDs, EV scenarios, and their implications. Over to you, Eduardo.
Hey, Nisabul, everyone. Can you guys see my slides? Just double checking to make sure that everything's okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ah, sweet. So my name is Eduardo, and today I'll be briefly presenting a preliminary quantitative analysis regarding fuel dependence and the role of electrifying urban transport fleets to reduce fuel imports in the Pacific. So I'll give an overview of the data we collected to conduct this analysis, what preliminary findings we have in terms of fuel dependence, provide 9 different scenarios for the integration of electric vehicles, and briefly discuss the limitations of the study. So we are currently in the process of constructing a comprehensive database which collates useful statistics for 19 Pacific Island countries and territories. These statistics include general demographics, economic indicators, energy infrastructure and operational factors, total energy and electricity consumptions in each sector, fuel demand, vehicle registrations, vehicles patterns of use, and energy balances, which broadly incorporate each country's imports, exports, stock changes, primary production, and transformation processes of the likes of crude oil refining, oil product-based electricity, biomass-based electricity, and charcoal production through biomass. So some of the main sources involved in this assembly include the UN's energy balance reports from 2018, UNESCAP, the US Department of Energy, IRENA, the World Bank, ADB, and NREL. And we are using this database for a variety of endeavors, but relevantly to the study to provide estimates of required energy and capacity, fuel import reductions, and emissions reductions associated with electrifying the Pacific urban transport fleet. So if we have a quick look at what this fuel dependence looks like, we see that as a percentage of total energy consumption, it's generally very high, ranging from 40 to 90%. Total energy consumption here includes electricity, natural gas, charcoal, coal and peat, and very importantly for the Pacific, traditional biomass, which covers a range of uses. If we look at these importing expenditures associated with urban transport, which include both the capital costs of importing vehicles, which many times are secondhand, and the operational costs of importing oil products, we also see that they're quite high. For refined petroleum, we have broken figures down into three main areas. Urban transport specifically, electricity production, and other purposes, which include a variety of sectors like mining, manufacturing, agriculture, forestry, etc. The contribution of each area is context dependent, but we see that urban transport in many cases has a significant presence in the overall usage mix. Overall, we see that refined petroleum imports constitute a significant portion of each country's imports, ranging anywhere between 2 and 52%. Differences between countries are associated with varying energy demands and differing import needs due to resource constraints. If we look at urban transport fuel consumption as a percentage of the total fuel supply, here defined as the final balance between production, imports, and exports, we see very strong contributions in most cases, and overall figures range from 10 to 60% roughly. So overall, it is clear that fuel plays a massive role in the energy balance of the Pacific. So what does transitioning to electric vehicles entail? So for vehicle types, including passenger cars, motorcycles, taxis, rickshaws, and a variety of buses and trucks, we can compare the fuel consumption per kilometer in internal combustion engine vehicles with the fuel consumption per kilometer in electric vehicles, which are fully charged from a diesel genset running at 3.5 kilowatt hours per liter. And what we find is that fuel consumption reductions are experienced for almost all vehicle types. So essentially, this is pointing to the fact that electric vehicles will be worth it in terms of reducing fuel consumptions and as such imports, regardless of the energy mix. So the EV integration scenarios we are considering constitute of three different levels of EV uptake: 100%, 50%, and 25%, and three different generation mixes: 100% renewables, 50% renewables and 50% diesel, and 100% diesel, totaling 9 scenarios. This serves to be only a very preliminary showcase of various integration scenarios due to the various assumptions involved. Most importantly, an average and indiscriminate fuel price and a vehicle fleet composition for all countries, which matches that of Fiji, with an additional adjustment so that estimated fuel consumptions from the proposed fleet match fuel consumptions reported in the 2018 UN Energy Balance reports. So if required electricity depends solely on the percentage of EV uptakes. So here we have our scenarios grouped into threes. In conservative scenarios, we see additional requirements between 5 to 10%, and in more extreme cases, up to more than double the current electricity requirements. Of course, capacity does not scale up the same way due to changes to local load profiles, which depend on EV usage and charging patterns, a detail which is not considered at this stage. Fuel import reductions in liters are also significant and scale up depending on the energy flows currently involved in each country. So PNG, New Caledonia, and Fiji see the most reductions, with the highest import reduction being 635 million liters of fuel, or roughly $775 million US, considering that fuel price we assumed. If we look at the economic impact of this fuel reduction as a percentage of GDP, we see that countries with low GDPs benefit the most from these reductions, showcasing how electrifying the urban transport fleet may provide economic incentives for countries with fewer economic resources, with up to 15% reductions. And as a percentage of imports, we also see benefits in high EV scenarios, so roughly between 10 and 15%. Emissions reductions are also significant due to the vast fuel requirements urban transport has for the Pacific. And we see that countries like Vanuatu, who redirect most of their fuel to urban transport, benefit the most from integrating more EVs. And finally, as mentioned, this is a very preliminary study based on a whole bunch of assumptions, and thus the limitations are present, some of which can be addressed at later stages, some of which are just inherent to the nature of this space. I won't go through them in detail, but they include things like the lack of capacity expansion models to estimate required capacities, accommodate virus integrations, the annual distance scaling to account for different island road network sizes, and of course, a vast dependency on the estimate of the vehicle fleet size for each country. So feel free to peruse later if you're interested. And just to say a special thanks to Atul, Ian, and Abraham for providing data and insights that is making this study possible. And thank you very much for listening. I'll pass it to the next speaker.
Thank you, Eduardo. I think you highlighted the importance of data for evidence-based decision-making, and I think you have all our support in terms of continuing this analysis and scenario modeling, etc. I think it's much needed information in the region. That's the regional level. We now move further down to the national level and talk about Fiji's land transport scene. The speaker deserves no introduction, Atul Raturi from USB, whose main area of research interest is on energy for sustainable development. Over to you, Atul.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello. Can you see my screen?
Yes, all good.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Solomon. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to do a quick overview of what is happening in Fiji and take you straight to the main streets of Suva. Although we say Pacific Island country, but if you come to Suva and if you drive early in the morning, in the afternoons, you will really see the problem that we have a congestion and the number of cars that are going around in Suva, greater Suva area. So quickly, if you look at the numbers, the vehicle numbers in Fiji have been increasing. This is a number from 2001 to 2018, and we could see that all sorts of vehicles, from private cars to commercial, the numbers have been increasing. On this side, I've shown you some percentage, and you can see that 5 to 10% increase. And mind you, this is before the COVID, so things would have changed in the recent last 1 year. But before that, the numbers, the cars were coming every day and every month, the new ships coming in. So the numbers are increasing. The vehicle intensity in Fiji is reasonably high, I would say, about 120 per thousand compared to, let's say, Solomon Island, where it's just 3-4, or in PNG, where it is 13-14. So the numbers are quite high, and you could see the relationship of this vehicle intensity with GDP. So you can see that as GDP, performs well, then the number of cars coming into the country is also increasing. So the intensity is can be related to the GDP, which we shall see that later. We have done some work on that. But the numbers, what kind of cars do we have on the roads? And we find that the second-hand Toyotas, basically, if you look at the private cars, second-hand Toyotas are ruling the roads in Fiji. And if you look at the age, you find that their cars were 30-40 years old, but on average is 10 to 15 years. So the cars are getting old. They, you can imagine the efficiency and the fuel economy of these cars. And they're still operating, they're still registered. So these numbers are not very conducive to what we're talking about, reducing the emissions. And older cars, and on the right-hand side, you would see this new registrations. And you would see that in 2014-15, suddenly these second-hand cars shot up. And these are mostly the hybrid cars because of the tax regime changes, and people could afford these second-hand hybrid cars. So they started coming to the country. And that is another reason why the numbers have really shot up. So you could see that this, in the present mixture of traffic, present mixture of automobile scene, these are the things happening. The older cars, second-hand cars, and mostly Toyotas that are running in Fiji. we did some work on this, and Ravita was the first author for this work. And we modeled Fiji's transport system. And what we did, we used this tool, which is called a long-range energy alternative planning system, LEAP, which is a standard tool for doing scenario-based studies. One of the challenges in Fiji and other countries is the data. Data is very difficult to come by. And if you want to do these kind of analysis, these modeling, you have to have data. So a lot of work had to be done. And Ravita did this work using a lot of survey tools, talking to people, talking to drivers, to get a sense of the fuel economy, the number of kilometers they travel every day, and those kind of things. And then she came up with this number. So we have this passenger activity, and then we modeled it. And then we say, okay, this is what is going to happen in next few years. So right after 2040, you would see that there is a steady rise. Again, mind you, this is pre-COVID calculation, pre-COVID numbers. So things would have changed in the last 1 year. But previously, this was the situation. So on the left-hand side, you had the passenger activity. And on the right-hand side, you have the freight activity. And both these things were based on the GDP growth. So we are looking at the business as usual, 1.3% growth in passenger activity and 1% growth in the freight activity. This is what we modeled on. And based on that, we said, okay, if we don't do anything, and this is going to happen, it's going to increase, and naturally the emissions are going to increase. Naturally, the fuel for the transport sector is going to increase. So what can we do? So as I said, we are doing this scenario-based scenario-based analysis. So we looked at various measures, and we looked at a range of measures, and I've listed them out, from model shift to carless days, to electric vehicles, to electric buses, eco-driving, bringing in biofuel, and then finally combining all these measures. And then if you're interested, I can share the paper with you later on. Ravita can share this paper, but it's assuming that these are the numbers which will happen, and the calculations how we reach these numbers is all given in this paper. And based on this, we said, okay, what is going to happen to the emissions, or what is going to happen to the petroleum consumption by the transport sector? And this is what it shows. So we see that all these interventions, whether cycling, modal change, or the transport, and we've been very, very conservative with these numbers. As I said, electric vehicles, we said only 5%. Things will change definitely. But what it shows that if we bring in all these efforts together, it is possible to reduce the fuel consumption by 40%, just by doing all the things that I talked about earlier, and also reduce the emissions by 25%. If you look at Fiji's NDC, the National Determined Commitments, the efficiency, the Fiji government says that by 2030 we should be reducing reducing the emissions for the transport sector by 10%. So we could see that all these efforts could add to that that ambition. Fiji has been very proactive, and the policy landscape, as I show you here, and you will learn more about this when people from Climate Change Office will come in, but you would see that all the policies, whether it is nationally determined commitments or the national development policy or the climate change policy, they give a very strong focus to transport, because 60% of the incoming petroleum fuel, retained fuel, goes into transport. And when I say transport, it's not only land transport, but the marine transport and also aviation. So the transport sector becomes very, very important. So all the policies, again, I'm not going to read these out, but you could have a look at these policies. You would see that there is a lot of support and a lot of good intention from the government side to bring down the emissions, bring down the use of petroleum fuel, and increase the sustainable transport sector, whether it is cycling, walking, and other measures. And this is Fiji's next. I'm talking about this in detail, so I will not spend too much time on this. But what it shows that if we want to go to sustainable transport, if you want to go to the net zero, then we have to electrify the systems. And it's very, very important that once we electrify, then this is Fiji Climate Change Bill, which has just been passed. And you could see that it says that the further effort should be supporting the lead support. So it means that this electrical energy for the transport has to come from renewable. As everyone has been talking about this, on the right-hand side, I show you this. This is the Tesla club owners, and they're charging their Tesla with diesel. As Eduardo said, that even if you charge with diesel, you're still reducing emissions, but this is not the best picture. You have to bring in the renewable resources. And one more thing we can talk about, when you bring in the renewable energy sources, we are reducing emissions and we are generating carbon emission reduction, CERs, as we used to call them in CDM regime. And I strongly feel that any carbon reduction done in the specific island country should have a special value, so it should have a special status. And when we trade them internationally, they should not have the same value as one generated in larger countries. So if you want to develop these carbon reducing activities, then we have to do this, special status, a special price for CERs generated in the Pacific. So this is just a thought. So as I said, we have to bring in renewable energy, and we have been talking about solar. Solar, we have seen day before yesterday, solar is going to be the future of the energy in the Pacific. And it turns out it is going to be a future of the transport sector too. I've just listed out some of the the vehicles, the common ones, and you could see the fuel economy. So with 30 kilowatt hour, you could travel 160 kilometers. That is in 2018. It has improved more than this now. And on the bottom side, you could see that typically in Fiji, people drive about 20, 30 kilometers, 15, 20. And if you're driving 15, 20 kilometers, then you need about 4 or 5 kilowatt hour per day. That is what your fuel consumption, electrical consumption would be. If you have 1 kilowatt system, you can produce that. In Suva or in Dundee, you could produce that much. So you can see that it makes sense to have a solar charging system, which could satisfy the fuel need, daily fuel need, especially in a city like Suva and in a country like Fiji. And the same thing is true for other Pacific Island countries where the distances are not that large. Just to give you an example of USP, we have about 1,200 parking places. We have 800 cars which enter daily. We have 200 to 300 cars parked 4 to 8 hours per day. We have shuttle, we have our own cars. And so what we can do is we have larger spaces where we can establish the solar car parks. So this is what the intention is. So we install solar car parks. I've shown you one picture where 100 cars could be parked easily. This is a new car park just come up. And the idea is to establish a 100 kilowatt system there, and we could connect it to the grid. And then we could also do a lot of research on this, because I'm sure you have heard of it, that once you have these electric cars connected to the grid, it could be a two-way transport. You could export electricity or you could also import electricity. So these cars would also help in stabilizing the grid. So this is a win-win situation. So as the more electric car come in, those batteries, those cars can be used for stabilizing the intermittent solar that will be connected to the grid. So but a lot of studies have to be done. So we think that we could do this kind of work as part of our development within the campus, and also smart grids. So the grids have to be changed, they have to be reshaped. They have to be much smarter than they are before. So there's a lot of research component in this. So this is the plan. And I think this will be like lots of universities around the world, they're doing it. UNSW just set up a new car electric vehicle charging system using their own cells, own panels. So that is a good news, and that is what university should be doing. This is just a vision. I said, okay, Suva CBD, if you go there, it is difficult to walk. It is impossible to drive. So what we can do is we can convert Suva CBD into a pedestrian, a bicycle, and a small EV, the small tuk-tuks and rickshaws. And we could have park and ride system where people come and, now Fiji government is already doing it, where they're using small suburban shuttles to bring people from greater Suva area. So those shuttles could stop just outside CBD, and then they can take these e-taxis, and the CBD could be full of all these solar charging stations So this is just a thought, and we could do a feasibility research on this and see whether it could be useful. So this is just a idea that I would like to leave here. My final slide is this quotation which I always like. It says that a developed country is not a place where the poor have cars. It's where the rich use public transportation. Gustavo from he's a mayor of Bogota. And on the right-hand side, you can see the top cities in the world, some of the best cities in the world, and they are all tops in sustainable mobility. So this is the future we should be looking at. So we should not be getting more cars and thinking that the country is developing, but how can we develop and how can we strengthen our public transport sustainably? I thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Abdul. I think we have mostly focused on the e-mobility in some ways, but I think the non-motorized options, opportunities to look at, including maritime mobility. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who after 5 years with the Climate Change Mitigation and Risk Reduction Program at the IUCN Regional Office, he joined the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport. He has a range of experience managing renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainable transport, and resource management projects in coordination with regional and international development partners around the region. He is none other than Andrew Irwin, who is so passionate about mobility, sustainable mobility in the region. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you for the introduction, Solomon. Let me get this going. Can everyone see? Is that working properly now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. It's taking up the full screen. It's not in... Okay, great.
The big cut.
All right. What was that? Sorry?
The left side of it is a bit shifted, at least for me. I don't know if everyone.
Oh,
Okay, now it's good. Now it's good.
that's better? Okay, great.
Perfect.
Hopefully this works. So yeah, I just wanted to point out, I'm always talking about bicycles, for those of you who know me, but I wanted to point out the other non-motorized transport elements that don't usually get the same amount of attention. So, non-motorized transport is part of everyone's day. And some, almost everyone is walking at least part of the way from and to their destinations when they're commuting, when they're engaging in other activities, going to and from stores, making sure that you have the infrastructure in place to facilitate the safe operation of non-motorized activities is incredibly important. I was thinking about this today, going up to the top of the hill of the supermarket, MH Superfresh on Mead Road, the corner there. They have put up walls that go right up to the edge of the car park, and so there is no pedestrian space allocated. I was noting here, I've got inline skates, scooters, skateboards. They all have very small wheels, and based off of the infrastructure development in most of the Pacific Island countries, we don't hit the appropriate pavement roughness index to allow safe operation of these types of non-motorized transport modes. So this is one of the things that needs to be considered if we want to see additional activity, beyond cycling, beyond pedestrian behavior. This is the kind of consideration that needs to go into place when infrastructure is designed. And this is something that comes into play with the personal automobile paradigm, which I think it's really important to point out. It's been one of the most destructive manifestations of industrialization and underregulated capitalism. It damages human health, environmental health, wherever it's adopted, leads to sedentary lifestyles and transitioning. On a one-to-one basis, I think it's really important to look at how of course, electric vehicles are preferable to internal combustion engine vehicles. And on a one-to-one basis, they will yield energy efficiency improvements. However, they don't do anything for reducing that congestion that's caused by vehicles that take up the same amount of space. The infrastructure maintenance costs of having the same number of vehicles, whether they're ICE or EVs, running over them. And the NCD rates from sedentary behavior are not impacted. And I think I'll get into this a little bit later, but the human health implications of our transport decisions are incredibly important. And it's something I'll highlight in the presentation later. But the bicycle has been repeatedly recognized as the greatest invention of modernity in a number of different polls in the UK and other places. And particularly in terms of avoidance of fossil fuels, we know the environmental benefits, the socioeconomic benefits, and on a per pound of material, kilogram for the mass dedicated to the inputs for creating bicycles, the ability that they confer to their users to expand their mobility options is far and away the best cost benefit ratio of any different vehicle type, which I'll illustrate in a few moments. I was looking at this really interesting comparison of a number of different electric vehicle models relative to the whole of life cycle emissions for bicycles, e-bikes, and compared to internal combustion engine vehicles and electric vehicles. And I am very much a bicycle devotee. I don't have an e-bike yet. I know Peter Johnson's on the call as well. He can talk about his e-bike experience to those who are interested. But there are a handful of people who have been picking them up around here. I've been pleasantly surprised to see how small the disparity in emissions and the level of activity that you see between bicycle users and e-bike users. And if we're looking to encourage people into active transport behaviors and building better, personal transport habits, the e-bike is far and away a more cost-effective and less energy-intensive way to introduce EVs without the same level of burden on the grid, while providing the same level of urban mobility. And here's a really good illustration on this slide of the mass, the battery capacity, and the energy consumption per kilometer traveled, or per 100 kilometers here. But you can see over here where in number A, letter A, the first diagram, where e-bikes are listed in bluish purple relative to passenger cars and the heavy light commercial and heavy duty vehicles that are electrified. You go down to the real world and certified energy consumption, pound for pound, for the mass that you're putting into producing these devices, you're getting the most mileage out of them. And in terms of power output and the ability, you need the least amount of power to generate the furthest amount of distance. In terms of overall efficiency, there's not a better option. So I thought this was really interesting because I mentioned, the disparity in terms of activity, in terms of active transport and non-motorized transport between bicycles and e-bikes. The disparity, the only way you're getting more exercise than on an e-bike is with a regular bicycle, but the disparity between riding an internal combustion engine passenger vehicle or an electric passenger vehicle, you're getting just so much more activity in your day by switching over to an e-bike, where you have the opportunity to both contribute your own caloric energy as well as deriving some sort of electric thrust support. So this is, I think it's really important to emphasize, from a climate change perspective, the impact of whatever mitigation activities the region as a whole undertakes will have a minimal impact because of the small populations, low overall emissions of the region. Whatever we do, even if we hit zero, net zero emissions by 2030, it's still a drop in the bucket compared to what the overdeveloped nations are contributing towards the consumption of our climate budget. But from an active transport perspective, whatever benefits we're able to realize within the region, those have direct impact on the health implications of the countries that around the region are seeing the highest obesity rates in the world. Top 10 nations in terms of obesity rates, all in the Pacific. Fiji's not far below there. It's in 30-something% in terms of obesity. Even New Zealand, I was surprised to see up there as well. So as far as the overall health and fitness implications of active transport, I don't think I think it's impossible to overstate how big an impact it will have on the general public health of each of the countries that are dealing with this decarbonization discussion. And if you can tie these co-benefits into the decarbonization of transport, why wouldn't we? As far as the economics of healthcare savings and the overall fuel reduction, the transport costs on a per person basis, I put together a version of a presentation similar about 2014, 2015, and was looking at the cost of how much Fiji has spent on its government fleet of Trailblazers and other large sport utility vehicles. For the cost of the it was about 2,100 vehicles at that point. The cost of the government fleet, you could have given every man, woman, and child in Fiji a bicycle at 650 Fiji dollars a piece. And in terms of urban mobility, it would be completely decentralized, and the recurring costs for fuel would be zero. Maintenance costs would be a fraction of what we're currently seeing in the automotive market. And I mean, that's one of the big issues that I've seen in my travels around the region, is around maintenance, service, supply chains, and the ability to keep bicycles in good repair. We've developed such a reliance on the automotive paradigm. You can go to a place like Tuvalu, where you can get your motorbike fixed at a number of different shops. There are 5 or 6 different motorbike dealers. But over the last 6 years, the supply chain for bicycle parts, tubes, tires, chain repair has just completely evaporated. And when I went for the first time back in 2015, I could still get a folding bike and ride it around. At this point, there's no one servicing bicycles. They don't have the supply chain. The retailers don't have established relationships with suppliers from other markets to get those bicycle parts back into the country and keep the bicycles that do exist up and running in good repair. And it's an incredible tragedy because you can see where we have gone backwards on certain aspects of sustainable development, and the automotive paradigm runs directly counter to sustainable development goals. So I just wanted to point this out from the actual survey data that I've collected around Fiji in 2017, 2018. We're seeing, most of the working age population between 18 to 55, you got 97% of the respondents, 75% of the total were traveling under 15 kilometers round trip per day. So 7.5 kilometers each way is well within the boundaries of an e-bike or bicycle journey. And when we see populations in island countries increasingly urbanizing, we're seeing this urban drift across almost every country in the region. And this is another reason, Eduardo, it would be really good to see your data unpacked around urban energy consumption, because if this is reflective of the situation across the region, this means, with the political will and the policy interventions, a bicycle and urban non-motorized transport intervention can eliminate, up to 75% of the trips that are currently being undertaken through internal combustion engine vehicles. Most of the people who are traveling each way, commuting, are doing so one per vehicle. And the opportunity for this kind of widespread replacement at a low cost, while we are working between the renewable energy sector, getting grid integration and the e-mobility policies and investment plans put into place for the coming years. This is the fastest, most effective way to inject financing into sustainable transport with the largest payout. So
Andrew,
I think
I'm sorry, Andrew.
Everyone can go through this once they get the presentation later.
Please, Andrew, you need to wrap it up, mate.
Thank you very much, everyone. So, the knockup.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew, and I thank our distinguished speakers for sharing their experiences and knowledge. Certainly, low carbon land transport, it's one of the many new things that the region is placing a lot of emphasis on. Certainly, there are options, and like they say, we need to do the maths. We need to do the modeling and the analysis, and we all need data in here to do the analysis thoroughly, given that land transport impacts on many other sectors, including fitness and health, other co-benefits also. And beside the importance of data, I think the emphasis on strategic partnerships, we see in here the role that the universities can play in terms of conducting research, in terms of the analysis, which would provide data and better evidence for countries to decide on their effort to address low carbon in the land transport sector. I think we are now due for a break. We are a little bit behind by 5 minutes, but we're doing very well. So let me thank the speakers and suggest that we take a 5 minutes break before the next session. Thank you. I guess in the meantime, I'll invite the speakers to look at the chat and please respond to comments that participants have put on the chat.
Yeah, look, thank you so much, Solomon. I've posted a Padlet link in the chat and I'll just post that again. Please feel free to take a break, but if you would like a chance to vote on what you see as some of the short-term priorities in terms of our various options. If you go over to the Padlet, you can vote on priorities across these different low carbon transport modes. And please also feel free to comment as well. Or perhaps you feel like you need a break. We'll start again at 7:05, but if you're interested, please do jump over to the Padlet and let us know what you think are the key priorities. Many thanks and see you in about 3 or 4 minutes.
Well, welcome back from the break, everybody. My name is Lang Sang To, and I'm speaking to you from Loughborough University in the UK. I'll be chairing this session on lessons learned and what we have learnt so far in the Pacific and other contexts that might inform our discussion today. I'm really excited about this session because we have such a diversity of speakers and from different areas. And I really think that, islands and the Pacific region are really leaders in thinking about mobility because the drivers for sustainable mobility is so strong, as we've heard in that first session today. So to assist me in looking after this session, I have invited Ian to sound a bell at 8 minutes for our speakers to invite them to wrap up their discussions at that point. I'll be taking questions at the end of each presentation, so do pop them in the chat. I love all of the discussions that are going on there. And Abraham Sitson has agreed to help me to monitor those chat messages as well. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Jeanette and Devjit to present on electric vehicle assessments for Fiji. Jeanette is the Climate Change Mitigation Lead at the Department of Climate Change at the Fiji Ministry of Economy. And Devjit is working as an economic advisor for the Ministry of Economy on greening and fine-tuning the country's economic recovery package to ensure alignment with the country's sustainable development and climate change goals. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present at this forum. So I'll be presenting on the electric vehicle landscape for Fiji. So I'll briefly begin with the background, just an overview of the transport sector in Fiji. Dr. Turi has already touched on this, so I won't spend too much time on that. And then we'll go on to talk about opportunities and barriers. I'll be co-presenting with my colleague Devjit, who's the economic advisor we have available through the NDC Hub, NDC partnership, sorry. Next slide, please. Okay. Just a brief highlight on the transport sector. Transport sector is the primary consumer of fossil fuel, as we have heard previously. It contributes about 64% of the energy sector emissions and 39% of overall emissions, mostly from road vehicles, which is 71% passenger vehicles and 18% from trucks. The transport sector contributes about 12% towards Fiji's GDP and has 30% capital budget and allocation annually. This sector is also highly vulnerable to natural disasters. It accounts for about 46% of annual asset losses from disasters and will require an estimated investment about 4.3 billion Fijian dollars to increase sector resilience. So that is in terms of climate change adaptation as well. Next slide, please. So just briefly on Fiji's NDC target. We have a 30% emission reduction target from a business as usual. 20% of this, of course, will be from 100% renewable electricity generation by 2030, and 10% is economy-wide energy efficiency. And here's where energy efficiency in transport sector will play a major role. So in our thinking, it might contribute if we are to transition to energy efficient vehicles, e-vehicles, e-mobility by the year 2030 and beyond. It can perhaps contribute even more than 10% to the emission reductions. In the NDC update that was submitted in 2020, towards the end of 2020, we have also committed to an economy-wide emission reduction, net zero emissions by 2050 as well. Just in terms of what we have heard from the previous speakers, the cost of inaction or delayed action, it can have a serious consequence on the economy and the population when we talk about sustainable development goals as well. But we also realize that the cost and the financial instruments that will be necessary, for example, to finance electric vehicles, charging stations, and then of course the associated assistance for infrastructure improvement planning, which is needed to support electric vehicles. So in terms of this, we have considered the resource challenges and the support that we need in achieving mitigation interventions, not just for the transport sector, but overall economy-wide. Then we have kind of developed the NDC investment plans. Now, this is not formally endorsed by Cabinet yet, but we've had the support from the NDC, regional NDC hub to develop project pipelines. And in terms of that, I'd just like to draw your attention to the capacity building and the technical assistance needs in terms of the cost. And as you can see, it is about $29 million US. And this is just for the primary mitigation options for the transport and energy efficiency sector. Just to zoom in a little on one of the mitigation options, electric vehicle network development, and just to consider some of the key implementation milestones. And the investment, of course, in this, it is understood that this opportunity will focus on importing new EVs and their charging station and installations. And included in this opportunity, the way we have framed it also looks at regulatory means to address end of life cycle issue for battery disposal. I don't think we have discussed this much in detail, but perhaps in the discussion we can use that space to discuss about the end of life issue as well in the Pacific. We're thinking that this opportunity can be implemented through government leasing and then later through private sector uptake. The investments determined in this opportunity do not include the investment needed to increase power generation capacity and strengthen the power distribution system in Fiji. However, like Dr. Raturi mentioned, under the LEDs scenarios, we have considered that under power generation. So some of the key implementation milestones that we are looking at under this opportunity is regulatory standards for policies that are related to both vehicles and infrastructure as well. And the associated state-owned entities, for example, the Land Transport Authority, EFL and FRA will require technical training for the development of standards. So it's just not a matter of importing these electric vehicles at first, but it's about also looking at the other aspects that we need to consider before we import. But I mean, that doesn't stop us from importing vehicles at the moment, but it's some of the things we need to start planning for. And in this investment planning, we are already thinking along those lines. So what can be some of the primary outcomes? Of course, is the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and the establishment of distributed charging network. The secondary outcome, of course, will be the removal of localized emissions and air pollutants from the internal combustion engines that are, impacting us, and the improved integration of transport and electricity generation storage subsector. Next slide, please. I just wanted to also highlight on Fiji's Climate Change Act. This act is to establish a comprehensive response to climate change, which will provide the regulation and governance of national response to climate change, to introduce a system for measurement, reporting, verification of greenhouse gas emissions and related matters. As we have heard, data seems to be a concern for us, and we also understand that the lack of comprehensive and substantial data is being a major roadblock in achieving climate actions. And personally speaking, it is becoming very difficult for us to implement certain activities. Furthermore, under Section 44 of this Act, we are planning to develop a transport decarbonization implementation strategy. So it's very much well aligned to the LEDs, but it will be focusing on how strategically we can transition towards e-mobility. So within 2 years of the enactment of the act itself, we will be developing this strategy. So planning of it is pretty much underway through the assistance, of course, of Devjit, who is the economic advisor. We are getting him to undertake a study on the EV landscape of Fiji. So looking at certain regulatory and fiscal measures that can actually help us in this transition, or maybe fasten this as well. So he'll be mentioning on the business models that he's looking at under the study. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to talk a bit about the opportunities and barriers. We are all aware of these
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me just take over right now. Sorry. Hi everyone. Yeah, just wanted to give you a kind of brief background regarding EVs, what is happening globally, as well as what is happening in Fiji. So in the left-hand slide, the figure kind of shows that like there's been a huge uptake of EVs over the last decade, and especially so over the last 5 years. Like in 2020, there has been like about 40% increase in EVs globally. And that has primarily been led by, for the country level, it's been led by China, and on the technology level, it's been led by battery electric vehicles. And if we see the right-hand side figure, in Fiji, there's currently about 130,000 vehicles registered by LTA, of which more than 80% is ICE, internal combustion engine vehicles, and 14,000 is about the plug-in hybrid, which is because of the measure in 2014 where they reduced the excise duty. And there's about 2,000 electric vehicles. But again, most of these electric vehicles are golf carts or buggies, which are mainly for the tourism industry, while the actual on-road vehicles would be a paltry number, I would say between 50 to 100. So we are looking into that data, and we'll get back later regarding that. And as mentioned before, I'll not stress too much on these slides. The opportunities in Fiji, there's few factors which will help adoption in Fiji, which is the renewable energy potential, the location advantage, which basically Fiji can become a good testing ground for new technology or market solutions, as well as because of the shorter distances, there could be low number of charging stations required. And let me go to the barriers. The barriers are kind of interesting. Firstly is the policy and governance, which was mentioned regarding we don't have a transport decarbonization strategy, which we need to work on. The regulations need to be worked on, especially like around the EV charging standards, the electric vehicles themselves. As well, there is a financing need for the infrastructure, because the current infrastructure is insufficient, and there needs to be significant investment required. Like a GGI report had mentioned that following the lead scenario, it would be, if you follow the very high ambition scenario, it could be around $6 billion USD till 2050. And then there is the issue regarding the markets, which I'll discuss later, regarding the business models which can be implemented or which can be thought about in Fiji, as well as the public perception, because as long as people are not seeing EVs on the road, then there is a kind of uncertainty regarding the range, regarding how safe they are, how reliable they are. So awareness building campaigns such as pilot studies, like the taxi study, which Alex will talk later, as well as the coming up the EV bus pilot studies, these could improve the adoption of EVs. And finally, I'll just discuss on some of the business models. So these are a few of the business models that are kind of being developed for EVs all around the world. And as you can see, there are three main categories, which is first is the purchase, second is lease, and third is battery separation. So purchase would mean, as the name suggests, it's kind of like an outright purchase or through loans, or it could be kind of a bulk procurement. Again, given how EVs are priced right now, the leasing model, especially for buses, seem more feasible. Like, for example, if a transit authority owns the bus and pays operators on a per kilometer basis, that could be one possible model. And thirdly is battery separation, which is again like a bit out there, right? Currently, there's like some models, like especially in Southeast Asia, regarding two-wheelers or three-wheelers, regarding battery swapping technology among developing countries. But again, this is something which we can look at further, whether this is possible, especially like for Pacific Island countries. Yeah, that would be for my presentation. And if you have any questions, thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really excellent. Looking at the chat, there are no direct questions, but there have been some discussions on different kinds of electric vehicles, including buses and e-bikes. So a bit of a continuation of the discussion from the previous session as well. So thanks so much for that overview of what's happening in Fiji. Now I'd like to introduce Katrina, who will talk about the e-mobility in policy. She's the Pacific Regional Advisor at GGGI. Katrina has 3 master's degrees in mechanical engineering, energy management, and sustainable development, and has been working on renewable energy and energy efficiency programs and projects for over 15 years in Europe, Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific. So over to you. Thank you.
Sorry, I just shared the wrong screen. Let me just find the right one. Okay, I tested this and now the right screen is not showing up for some reason. Anyway, I'll show the one I had. That'll be fine. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Great. So yes, I'm Katerina. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. For those who don't know, the Global Green Growth Institute, we're an intergovernmental organization with our HQ in Seoul. But we have 40 country members around the world. 5 of those members are in the Pacific. That's Fiji, Vanuatu, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, and Kiribati. But we also work in the Marshall Islands, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Samoa, and through the Pacific NDC Hub, we try to reach out to all the countries in the Pacific. So just to set a bit of the scene, I just wanted to briefly just show this. There's been obviously energy consumption in the Pacific has been increasing. But sadly, we don't have a great amount of data on which sectors are using the most data, which sectors are using the most energy. And very roughly, we do know that a lot of it is being used by transport. But for the Pacific to break that down between maritime and land transport and air transport is actually very difficult. But anyway, we know transport is using a lot. And then on the right, just drawing your attention briefly to this is the electricity generation across all the Pacific Island countries. And we can see that although a lot of efforts we made in electricity to introduce renewables, it's still a very small proportion of electricity production. And if that graph was showing the transport sector, it would be 100% diesel, as I think other speakers have alluded to. So we really need more renewable energy efficiency, or similar objectives for the transport sector to start trying to cut down on the fossil fuel dependency. And the diversification of supply will help with energy security. And we also need indicators to monitor and measure that, and better data collection. That's also already been measured, or already been mentioned. So yeah, so moving on, I think there haven't been that many policies up to now, but I think that's changing quite fast around e-mobility as it's mentioned in policies, and also just sustainable transport in general. And obviously the new regional framework mentions sustainable transport, and it's just been mentioned, obviously that's in the Fiji low emissions development strategy. I'll just mention that because it's one of the things that I worked on, so I know it well. And that had like 4 scenarios, and as you can see on the left, all 4 scenarios, electric vehicles actually featured quite strongly, even in the, so for any reduction in emissions, electric vehicles are seen as quite an important part of that emission reductions. But if there were other measures as well, like non-motorized transport, efficiency, etc. And there's going to be, I think, a lot of more policies, upcoming policies and strategies that are going to start including e-mobility, sustainable transport. And one of the challenges is going to be the linkage between the institutional frameworks around electricity and around transport, and for ministries and departments to start working more closely together from those 2 sectors. So what I mainly wanted to talk about is just give a quick overview of this small study we did a couple of years ago, which focused on Viti level in Fiji and kind of modeled the low emission development scenario for private vehicles, taxis, and small vehicles in Fiji. It didn't do buses. And what you can see on the left is from the low emission development strategy, you can see land transport, electricity, that's that red part, without, if we're going to introduce EVs, from 2025 onwards, 2050, there's a huge increase in electricity generation needed to power those electric vehicles. It's by 2050, it's 50% of the generation demand. So obviously the grid is going to play a really big part. So what did we find out about the grid when we did this study is that there's a few things. So for example, the houses. So there's not really the electrical infrastructure there needed to, to support vehicle charging. So that would need to be upgraded. In terms of charger placement, we looked around Viti level. Charger placement wouldn't be so much an issue of how often you charge it, but where it would be placed so that you wouldn't have to upgrade the existing grid, or otherwise you'd have to pay more money again to be able to upgrade it. We also noticed a province effect. Suva is usually the place where the highest electricity demand in the country, in Viti level. But with this modeling, we found that Nandi Lautoka corridor would also grow to be almost equal in electricity requirement. So that again would create shifts in what the grid would need to be providing and infrastructure. And the island-wide effect would be that the daily load profile would change would change. And it wouldn't be the same as it is now. And this has been mentioned just now by Dutcher, that the range of investment, depending on the scenario, would be between 1 billion and 6 billion. Now, of course, balancing the grid is harder in Pacific Islands than it is in bigger economies and in larger continental areas where you have access to long distance electricity exchanges and transmission networks. But there are also opportunities for the grid operators in the e-vehicle transition, so to speak, is that it could offer an opportunity to integrate demand response into grid management through the use of through remote use of vehicle batteries. And but time of use tariffs will probably need to be factored in by utilities as electric vehicles come in, so they can influence when people are charging their vehicles. Okay, so those are some of the findings, just very briefly. And what is GGI doing? Well, we really see this as an important space, and we're looking forward to working at a regional level with a number of countries. We think we can, start doing pilots and deliver, more than 1,000 units of e-mobility technology. We don't know which technology yet. We want to work with governments and with partners to do feasibility studies. There's a lot of CO2 emission to be mitigated, and there's a lot of new green jobs that can be created. So this, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but it would cover, we want to work on the essential studies that are needed, technical and financial, develop the concept notes and the right business models, and look with partners at mobilizing the investment so that pilot projects can really be implemented. And because, showing people something can be done is a good way to change behavior, change attitude, and so that it's a realistic option. Yeah, so, and also I'd just like to mention we are hiring a senior transport specialist to join our team here as well in the Pacific. We're very excited about that. So just one last comment. I spent my whole presentation talking about e-mobility, EVs, but I really don't believe that's the whole solution. I think the sustainable transport needs a much more holistic solution, which has been mentioned by other speakers. So while we look at EVs, and that's important, I think it's very also important to look at, emission standards for conventional vehicles and for the existing fleet and new vehicles coming in, secondhand vehicles, new vehicles. Jeanette just mentioned, what about end of life? How are we going to collect old vehicles, get them off the road, and have a good scrappage system? Hybrid vehicles have got a role. Public transport, that's one of the most very important, very difficult because it involves behavioral change. And then also non-motorized, the walkways, bicycle lanes, pedestrianization, and also above all, integrating the transport planning with urban planning so that services and people, they are working together. The 5-minute or the 15-minute city. I really like that idea. And I think Suva's really got a great potential to be like that. Yeah, so that's just, that's all from me. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, just let me know. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Katerina. That was really great. I've been looking at the chat as well, and there's some discussion actually on from the previous discussion on sort of battery recycling, and but there is one specific question for you, which is that the audience would like to know a bit more about your organization, wondering if it is an NGO entity. So perhaps you'd like to give a few brief words on the overall organization.
Yeah, sure. So no, GGI isn't, well, it's not really an NGO, no. We're an intergovernmental treaty-based organization. So a little bit like IRENA, where countries can become members. So our members are governments, or in other intergovernmental organizations can also become members. So yeah, so we're not really an NGO, no. We're more like IRENA or even the UN, but we are a little bit smaller, quite a bit smaller than the UN. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. And I'm sure there'll be more discussion in the chat as well. But now I'd like to introduce Pamela, who is the Senior Transport Specialist from the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. She's going to speak about ADB's work on energy mobility in the Pacific region. She's an experienced team leader with 20 years of international experience in development and management of transport projects, including urban transit systems, railways, seaports, airports, roads, and cross-border transport. So over to you, Pamela.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right, okay, I'm just gonna switch off my video for a better connection. And you can see my screen, right?
No, I can't see the slides.
Okay, just a sec.
And just a note to our speakers, actually, I think Zoom is filtering out the alarm that Ian is sounding at 8 minutes. So perhaps that we need to keep an eye on our own timing there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Longxing. Can you see my screen now? Is it okay?
Yes, perfect.
All right, okay. So thanks very much, Longxing, for the kind introduction, and thanks also to SPC, PIFS, USP, PPA for organizing this really important dialogue. And it's been really exciting for me to hear about all the I mean, lots of developments happening in this space in terms of renewables and promoting and scaling up e-mobility, which is great. And I'm very honored to join this session alongside, of course, many eminent panelists today. And I just look forward to share what I can on what ADB is doing in this e-mobility space. So the work that we do in ADB is very closely aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, as you can see here. ADB Strategy 2030, as well as the Paris Agreement, which all have climate change mitigation and adaptation objectives embedded within them. Now, on the SDGs, although there is no dedicated transport sector SDG, transport sector projects in ADB do make meaningful contributions to various goals and targets in sectors such as water, energy, innovative infrastructure, sustainable cities, climate action, agriculture, as well as well-being, if we consider like road safety and air pollution. And moving across the page, we have Paris alignment, and ADB is working towards full alignment from, as you may know, July 2023, which is in about 2 years' time. So the Paris Agreement aims to keep the rise in global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. And our pipeline is also designed with ADB Strategy 2030, as you can see below. And we have what we call seven operational priorities. And the third operational priority, as you can see here, is on tackling climate change, building climate and disaster resilience, and enhancing environmental sustainability, which is relevant to the e-mobility topic that we're here today to discuss. So I just wanted to share that in ADB, we strive to promote e-mobility through a package of support, which can broadly be classified in this circular fashion. And we start with technical assistance. We have been conducting initial assessment of EV opportunities, and this is more global scale. So it's not just Pacific, but it's across the region which we serve. We look at commercial and business models for EV deployment, enabling environment, etc. And this then leads to project identification and development, and I've included some example of the projects that have been implemented for reference. And actually, there are quite a number of exciting opportunities. I understand my colleagues are exploring with various countries in the Pacific, but one of the more firm ones that we can share, I've included here, is a new upcoming project on the disaster resilient clean energy financing project in Palau. And so moving on from project development, we have project financing. ADB offers, as you may know, sovereign and non-sovereign loans for project financing. And oftentimes we also bring in other multilateral development banks, Green Climate Fund, Global Environmental Facility, and other bilateral support, etc., to co-finance investments. And to augment the benefits, we also seek to support knowledge sharing and capacity development. And this is to raise awareness on best practice project design, technical know-how. And these could be done through events such as training opportunities, regional workshops. And with this enhanced awareness and engagements with client governments and stakeholders, we will then continue our policy dialogue to continually identify further areas of technical assistance, and then the cycle continues. So I thought it would be useful to share some of the factors that we consider in packaging e-mobility projects. And listening to various speakers who have shared, it's not too different from what everyone is doing. But let me just broadly categorize them. We look at environmental factors, which includes grid factor, emissions, pollution levels, regulatory environment. We also look at policy factor, alignment with NDCs, long-term strategies. We also look at economic factors. What's the fuel price, subsidies? What are the tax incentives to enable e-mobility uptake? And so, for example, for subsidies, I just wanted to give an example. Like we know in People's Republic of China, for example, e-bus, e-taxi operators enjoy subsidized rate for overnight charging, and this helps them to also even out the load factor. So these levers can be considered to explore in structuring the e-mobility project. In terms of financing, we talked about in the previous slide, but it's important to also note the business models, what fits the local context. And finally, also material considerations to also include things like we've heard earlier on, like charging infrastructure, is that readily available? And how will the EVs be powered? Battery life, disposal, charging. And finally, I just want to say, even all this infrastructure, if that is in place, how reliable that is, that also can impact on the uptake of e-mobility. Now, since time is very limited today, I just wanted to share a bit more details on the select considerations that I mentioned in terms of grid factor and fuel prices. So we look at, on the left-hand side, the grid factor in the region, and the red highlights the high grid factor. And due to high grid factor, we need to be mindful that deployment of EVs could only result in limited GHG reductions. But this is not to say that we do not support decarbonizing transport in these areas, because there's still scope to develop alternative strategy to promote low carbon trajectories through a combination of scaling up energy production, alternative fuels, green hydrogen, etc. And the right-hand side just shows a comparison of fuel prices. So fuel prices, as we know, contribute to the running cost of the vehicle. And so generally, the higher fossil fuel price in relation to electricity cost will create a positive environment for EV uptake. So this is the main study that we have done for, as you can see, the region outside of Pacific. So for the purpose of this particular session, we've put together some very rough estimates for Pacific countries with much thanks to my colleagues. So, but just to note that we had to use proxies for grid factor, and I do apologize. You know, the presentation, the small circles here is quite difficult to interpret. But so this is showing just the Pacific region and not with the rest of the world, and we've used proxies, yeah? So as we heard, generally in countries in the Pacific already quite reliant on imported fuel for energy consumption, including the transport needs. And so this chart just highlights that there are areas, in fact, more than half the countries experience even higher fuel tariffs. And the grid factor in the map below is also above average in more than half of the Pacific countries we can see. So this really highlights the opportunities to really scale up clean and renewable energy power generation. And there are interesting debates going on scaling up clean power generation to replace existing demand. And hey, as well as to service incremental electricity demand from new sources, such as through electrification of transport. So as we know, it could be quite costly to provide new sources of renewable energy generation, particularly since conventional electricity demand is quite limited. But what if we include transport and other sectors? And this could develop projects at scale to meet future demand and support from an accelerated energy transition perspective. So I just wanted to share that those are some of the interesting debates, and let me leave that interesting possibility with you. And if there's interest, please do reach out to our energy team. And this slide just shows the lifetime of GHG emissions of fossil fuels. And this ranges from the smallest emissions from 2 to 3 wheelers to the largest ones. And I just wanted to share this for just context, that it is for this reason that most effective, it's most effective to reduce GHG emissions by shifting people from their cars to PT modes. And you may notice at the moment, we do not have any comparative info on boats. And that's something that we are trying to pilot, and also to work with you to find out more information, as we do recognize maritime is an important mode in the Pacific.
For 150 Fiji dollars. I just checked and it's 188 US dollars normally. So, if you did just have a yellow. By Grab Thar's hammer, what a savings.
Okay, so I'll just continue. In terms of policies and targets, it's important to also consider the context of local policies and targets of each country. And this is just a compilation by our Asian Transport Outlook, which is a recent initiative in ADB. So it's really important for us to understand what is the level of readiness of each country and the ownership on the EV ideas in order to work with our respective client countries on the optimal support package. So I think this is the second last slide now. And I just wanted to say that it's really important to reiterate that we do recognize that a one-size-fits-all solution cannot work. We do deploy different strategies across regions according to their local needs. For example, like, you know, in places like Mongolia or Central West, our challenge is high fuel costs and high grid factors, and extremely low temperatures, making it challenging for like e-mobility solutions using, let's say, batteries, right? This is too cold to even operate those batteries. But it's different in the Pacific, where we have abundant sunshine and possible wind and hydro energy sources. So I wanted to share the Pacific approach, which was recently published, that sets out the core development challenges. It also maps out ADB's support in priority areas to better prepare Pacific countries for responding to shocks. All of which to shocks and also sustainable services and inclusive growth. All of these e-mobility could contribute to, as we have also heard earlier. And these are some of the other publications that we have released, and we are about to release a new one to synthesize the right range of e-mobility studies we've taken in the past 2 years. And this is the final slide, just to share that we've recently secured some funding to establish a support and investment platform for Asia and the Pacific, and this is in partnership with our UN Environmental Program. We are seeking to deliver 3 core areas of support to our regions, including Pacific. The first is to enhance capacity development of government, and mainly through establishing networks and communities of practice and providing training. The second is to catalyze replication of high demonstration projects through establishing marketplace to convene public, private sector, industry experts, tech providers to accelerate uptake of e-mobility. And last but not least, we would like to support and develop project concepts for implementation. And this is to be done through, you know, possibly technical advisory and support on early project identification of ideas. So let me leave some details here in case it's of interest. So on a final note, I just wanted to say, so although we've made some headway on e-mobility, there's still so much potential to do so much more, and together with all of you and with all our partners. So let me stop here and hand you back to Long Seng. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pamela. Great to hear about the great work at ADB. In the chat, there were further discussions about the linkages with maritime, sustainable maritime transport, and also of waste as well in the Pacific, which is, of course, interrelated issues when we're talking about sustainable land transport as well. So now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Kalim, who will talk about a review of the Caribbean experience with e-mobility. Kalim is director of the Island Policy Lab and assistant professor of energy and environmental policy at the Joseph R. Biden Jr. School for Public Policy and Administration at the University of Delaware. He is also global coordinator of the United Nations Universities Consortium for Small Island States. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my share. There we go. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so thanks for having me. And my job in my couple of minutes here is, I suppose, to provide some updates on the transportation policies and particularly with regards to EV and hybrid transition in the Caribbean as a matter of comparative discussion and perhaps sharing of ideas and best practices across regions. So what I'll do is I will start with a review of what the NDC targets look like in a sampling of countries that have submitted NDCs. And then I will talk about how national policies have been trying to operationalize the targets and goals set in the NDCs. So first off, with regards to the NDCs in some of the Caribbean countries, you'll see that from this chart, you'll quickly see some countries have already submitted. For example, Antigua and Barbuda have submitted in 2015, and an update just this year. And some countries have submitted one NDC so far. And you quickly start to see a couple of the policy actions, or rather the targets and objectives listed in the NDCs. There's some similarities in approaches. I won't go through all of this. I'll provide these slides for you. But across countries in the Caribbean, you see things. For example, one big commonality is government's commitment to transitioning of public transport, so EV buses and so on, and attendance to that, some amounts of commitment to transitioning of government fleets, right, the public sector fleets as well. You see that. For example, in Antigua and Barbuda, where there's a commitment to 100% government vehicles to EVs by 2035. And you also get some of that discussion, but without the numerical targets listed here, right? Belize, we're looking at public transit system, deployment of 77 hybrid and electric buses by 2030 as another example. One of the other pieces that you'll notice in the NDCs for these Caribbean countries is that there are transportation sector, land transportation sector targets. So fuel efficient vehicle transition. Very few of the NDCs are specified enough to speak to electric vehicle goals or targets by certain dates or timelines. All right, but you know there is some amount of that in some places, and again you'll also see just pulling out the transportation sector items, action items here from the NDCs, that there is a great range of ambition, even amongst these islands that we look at here, from what I would call, debatably very low ambition to sometimes somewhat high ambitions, and probably bordering on probably unrealistic ambition in some cases, right? Hopeful, but might be a little bit difficult to get to. All right, so this is what the targets look like. Now, to move the targets, the NDC targets to operational level within each of the countries, we've looked at how the national energy policies and various other pieces of national legislation, policies, and strategy documents try to operationalize the NDCs. Now, the first thing that you notice is there's actually no, there's very few of the countries that have a cycle of commitments to the NDCs and then a review of the national policies to put things into action, right? So this is a policy challenge in the Caribbean to have that cyclical unison of alignment between setting NDC targets and then supporting them by timely policies and strategies. All right, and you see that difference here. You see a range of so what is in existence, and we look here at policy documents that have been approved and ratified by island governments, and not promissory strategies that have not happened, or feasibility studies that have not been operationalized through the governance actions, right? So you have a range. So Jamaica's last National Energy Plan, the National Energy Plan (NEP) was in 2009 for 2010 to 2030, and that's on the lower end of the scale of where their modernization is. So this is not in alignment with the more ambitious NDC targets that they've set out, right? And all the way up to some of the more recent national policies that have been approved. In Guyana, they have a draft NEP, well, since 2016. Cayman Islands 2016, Barbados has one of the more progressive national energy policies that actually is very much aligned to operationalizing the NDC goals and targets, and then others are in between and quite old, right? So it then begs the question of setting newer NDC targets. How are you actually operationalizing it at the country level? So we also had a look at that more specifically, and I will share a chart here. So what we try to do is, in our review, is look at NDC targets, look at the actual documentation of what policies and strategies have been approved and often funded by government, right, or other entities, and what is actually happening. And what we see is, for example, I was mentioning already, Barbados, for example, is one of the more progressive. They've actually had about, in 2018, 1.28% of total car sales being electric vehicles, and that amounts to about a little less than 200 vehicles by 2018. So that is probably about the most progressive in terms of EV sales in the region right now. In 2018 or 2019, the Dominican Republic, which has a much larger traveling population, 4 million people, 4-5 million people, but they have been high up there in terms of EV sales. 2018, 2019 figures up to 300 or so EVs, private EVs sold. So those are the better figures in the region. Barbados is, we've put Barbados in as probably the most progressive. They have the EVs being sold, some amount of volume, tax incentives to car dealers, but also incentives for training of the labor force, mechanics, and so on, in the EV and hybrid vehicle technologies. some other progressive kinds of approaches occur in Jamaica as well, in terms of the types of tax breaks that they've been able to structure, and the size of the tax incentives. Guyana, which has a low traveling population, actually has been doing well, at least on the policy side, regarding tax exemptions for cars and financial incentives for the private sector to develop charging station infrastructure. The Dominican Republic, as I was mentioning, they have a little bit of a different situation where, because of the DR-CAFTA trade agreement with the US, all their vehicles come in duty-free, including the EV vehicles, and perhaps that also contributes to some of these successful sales that they have had.
Excuse me, Kalim, can I invite you to bring us to your conclusions?
No problem, no problem. Sorry about that. Yes, so where would my last slide then would be the review of all of these factors. We've been trying to look at sort of a policy S-curve of the readiness for the technology acceptance in the Caribbean, and compared to some of the other benchmark island countries in other regions as well. And we see sort of across the board from pre-development, where there's not much happening policy-wise, not much has actually been approved by government, to this sort of what we call this second phase of transition in the S-curve, where we see some kind of takeoff of policy. So some policy, draft policy, some policies and strategies in play, and other types of feasibility studies being commissioned and actually happening, to where we're actually seeing quite a bit of movement, where we believe that places like Barbados and the Cayman Islands have a solid policy framework to move forward, and actually seeing some movement in terms of sort of the outcome of public transport vehicles and privately owned vehicles moving towards the EVs. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And, you know, I think the rich experience of the Caribbean really helps us to inform our discussions today. So thank you so much for that. There weren't any direct questions in the chat, so I will now introduce our next speaker, who is Caitlin. She is a final year PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales. She is investigating electric vehicles in the Australian national electricity market, and is focusing on the differences between vehicle types. She's going to speak to us today about tools and studies for modeling. Over to you, Caitlin. Caitlin?
Sorry, that was the exact moment my internet decided to struggle.
You're back now. You're fine.
Share my screen. All right, can everyone turn out the timer? Sorry, am I back?
Yes, you're back, but we can't see your slides yet. Oh, it's coming.
Great. So sorry, my internet is very poor. So my name is Caitlin. I'll be talking about modeling electromobility with a real focus on how to model it for long-term planning for electricity systems. And so we've talked a lot about benefits of electric vehicles today, namely increased fuel security, reduced emissions and whatnot. And there are significant challenges from the grid integration perspective. And these challenges, we're seeing them happening globally, regardless of size of electricity system that you're integrating them in. And the key challenges are really increasing your overall electricity consumption, which might trigger the need for additional generation capacity. It might also trigger the need for augmentation structure. Sorry, let me just turn off my camera. Okay. And also increased peak demand events and increased ramp requirements for your generation. And a challenge that has been flagged by a lot of people around the integration between three previously unlinked sectors in terms of data sharing, but also future planning. What makes things interesting from a modeling perspective is that all of the different types of vehicles have different features, and these different features are different for different countries as well. And so this is a framework I like to use to think about where modeling efforts are most needed in terms of grid planning. And these features are how many vehicles there are, if there's a large amount of vehicles or not, the usage of the vehicles and therefore how much we need to charge them, the temporal concentration, so if these vehicles are charging at the same time, and if they're charging at the same place. And you can sort of understand these different features for each different mode from various data sources. As been flagged by a lot of people today, data is really challenging to find for all of these modes, but in particular modes that are more commercial in their nature and less likely to share data. And this will look different for every country. But here's a snapshot from Australia, which is where I'm based. And for example, we've got a lot of bicycles here, but they're not used often. We don't expect that they will charge at the same time if electrified. And we don't expect that they'll charge at the same location either. And conversely, modes like taxis and ferries, we expect them to charge in the same place. They use a lot of electricity, but there's not many of them. And so once you've got this sort of image, you can start to map out where your modeling becomes more and more important. So if a mode only scores highly on one of these, or indeed none of them, you can imagine there's a relatively low impact to your electricity sector compared to if you have a lot of overlapping features. And what's really important, at least in the work that I've been doing, is understanding the differences in terms of your local planning. Modes that charge centrally in one location, it becomes much more important to any grid or microgrid situation compared to vehicles that aren't charged centrally. So I'm just going to give two brief examples of the work I've been doing for the Australian National. This is a very large interconnected dispatch model. There are open source tools like OpenSem, which can be modified to represent a mini grid or a microgrid scenario or change the grid location. The other tools you might be familiar with is Plexos. And the data that you need that I've been needing to input to these sort of things are the projection of number of electric vehicles in the future, charging traces, connectivity of those vehicles to the grid traces. And that can start to answer some interesting questions. questions like, will we need more generation or transmission to support the uptake of different electric vehicles? And in Australia, we're finding, yes, in the future, we are going to have to add additional generation and transmission network to support the electrification of transport. And you can start to have a look at more exploratory sort of questions, like what sort of charging would be best for future electricity grids? And therefore, how can we better design our tariffs? And this is my last example, which is we're finding for, as I mentioned before, for some modes, it's important to look at and for Australian context, buses, ferries, taxis, they become more important to look at from this local level because at the system level, they really don't have much of an impact. So this was a brief study I did looking at electrifying buses just north of Sydney. And we found that some substations weren't impacted at all, but some substations were increased in terms of their yearly critical peak by 17%, which is fairly substantial. And there are a lot of different tools available for this, but using some kind of geospatial mapping tool is really helpful here. And finally, I'd just like to flag something that has been flagged by so many people. The good data is really hard to find. And don't worry about the detail in this slide, but what it's trying to say is there are a lot of different inputs that come from a variety of different places, like the transport sector, and then more social sectors. More and more vehicles can actually help the electricity grid. So yes, in conclusion, for modeling electric vehicles, it really is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And every single different country will have a very unique configuration of these factors that I talked about before. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. You too have escaped direct questions from the audience, but there are notes of congratulations in the chat for you on a really nice framework to consider different vehicles, and also a note that the tools that you've used is actually open source, so it's available for others to use and to modify. So I think that's really important in terms of research as well. I'd like to now introduce our next speaker, who is Alex. He's going to talk about electric vehicle taxis in Suva. He's currently the general manager for the e-mobility startup called Charge Pacific, which is in the process of installing electric vehicle fast charging network. The e-taxi initiative is part of a wider project aiming to give Fijians a first-hand experience of e-mobility. So over to you, Alex. And you may be on mute, we can't quite hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. I've seen everyone else do it and then I do it. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me. As I said, I feel a bit like the diversity hire because I'm approaching this from a more commercial angle, and but it's very interesting to hear your own takes on it. As I said, I'll start from my intro slide. The global project itself, the vision is to come at the e-mobility sphere from an emissions reducing perspective, with the idea that matching flexible supply with intermittent supply with flexible demand is a pathway going forward. And what we see is that the Pacific is kind of an unparalleled opportunity because it has basically the ideal circumstances for e-mobility: short urban travel distances, a limited road network, access to cheap EVs from Japan, relatively cheap electricity, and the potential to add renewable energy going forward. So that's the kind of commercial vision. And so what we're thinking is that the opportunities are there, the incentives are all right, but enough to get it going. And what we're looking to do is install a first charger in October. No, end of October it arrives, middle of November it should be installed. And what we're going to do is launch that in conjunction with a demo EV taxi, which will give Fijians a first chance to actually get in an EV, because so much of the LEDs, etc., call for massive adoption of EVs, but very few people on the ground and even in the policy sphere actually know what being in an EV is like. I myself hadn't even been in one until about a year and a half, 2 years ago when I bought one, untested, from Japan to test the supply chain, as it were. So following that inaugural introduction with the taxi, what we're going to do is link up Suva to Nandi initially, depending on funding. And we're hoping to pair one of our fast charging stations with a 90 kilowatt solar array. Most of the excess would be used on site, but in effect, it would offset the emissions of about 90 vehicles, which is about, well, 75 more than we have now. So a pretty good start in terms of decarbonization. And what I think the initial goal is, there is a clear commercial opportunity here and across the Pacific. I mean, I was looking at a GGGI project in Tonga, and when you look, the circumference of the main island of Tonga is 60 kilometers. I mean, you can drive that twice with most EVs. Like, you don't even need public charging there. You should go for it now, unless you plan on driving around it 3 times, in which case that's another case. But what we're finding in Fiji is that policy is being pushed a little tentatively, I'd say, but the actual discussion that you're all talking about, which needs to happen, is just not happening. The utility is not engaging. Many of in effect, everyone goes back to chicken or egg. And the truth is, if you get a chicken, you'll have eggs. And if you get an egg, you'll end up with a chicken and then more eggs. And so what we're trying to do is almost catalyze that discussion and make everyone talk about these things that need to be talked about, so that e-mobility can be launched right from the beginning. Because what you have here is a grid system that is fragile and unable to cope with a poorly designed EV adoption. And by pushing that down the line and leaving it to sort of a spontaneous adoption along the lines of, let's say, New Zealand. No, actually, New Zealand have done it pretty well. But if you let people just adopt EVs and install charging stations willy-nilly, what will happen is you'll have people charging at peak times. You'll have no, in effect, you'll strain a very delicate grid to the maximum. Whereas what I see is a huge potential to match EVs and the increased adoption of solar. I mean, we're currently at 0.5% of generation, apparently. So we've got some room to go. But I think electric mobility has, and I think also there's just a lack of awareness in the policy circle about the improving technology behind specifically the software side of things. And for instance, the GGGI's assessment of the potential in Fiji talked extensively about the need to upgrade hardware because you'd be lining up multiple EVs in the same location, et cetera, et cetera. Many of the things that Caitlin was talking about. But actually with modern software, what you have is you have endless opportunities to reduce the impact on the grid. You can group chargers so they don't exceed a certain potential. You can put chargers on let's say a phase or so that they don't exceed the transformer's capacity. You can limit power in endless ways. You can put all the chargers in the country as a group and make sure they don't exceed a certain power at a certain time. And I think rather than regarding it as a threat, the utility should see this as an opportunity, and the regulators, I should say, and devise structures that ensure that these things can be monetized early so that we end up with the benefits of them longer term and have people be part of that system right from the start, and we can design it with the grid in mind from the ground up. Of course, this is quite hard if the grid isn't talking to you and tells you it's not a priority, which is currently the case. But the fact is that we don't need the grid's permission to install on commercial properties. So we're going ahead with that. We're going to link up the 2 main cities of Viti Levu, make transport possible, and then hopefully embolden policymakers to look at their own procurement, look at e-bus, because the challenges of, let's say, e-taxis are exactly the same as e-buses, just on a very different scale. So anyway, I'll bring it back to the taxis, which I'm supposed to be talking about. The taxis are a huge opportunity for Fiji. The running costs, as we all know, are extremely low. They're high mileage users who stand to benefit the most. And what we're almost doing is introducing one and flushing out a lot of the challenges that make it so difficult to, everyone wonders why hasn't the transition happened? Yet there are so many small things that stop people from making that shift. For instance, leasing is not allowed for taxis for some reason. We haven't figured out why, but for instance, leasing would allow taxis to, with limited capital, to switch to EV, enjoy the benefits and repay it over a longer period. The math works, the economics work, but it's not currently possible. And I think once something hits the ground, the conversation will start and we'll be able to start actually making progress and start giving people a real idea of what they're about, the opportunities, the challenges, and go on actual data. As I said, the data is apparently hard to get, but with a proper back-end software, you get all your data. We're hoping, with Dr. Raturi, we're hoping to do, and the Ministry of Economy, hoping to launch a 10 taxi trial, which would have geotagging of the taxis and precise monitoring of their energy consumptions, their charger requirements, etc. And that would give real data. I mean, limited, of course, because it's 10 taxis, but give real data going forward to assess the energy requirements of, let's say, a fully electrified taxi fleet, the charger requirements. Do they even need chargers if ranges keep expanding? Public chargers, that is. So all these questions have answers. We're just not in a position to get them right now. And I think unless we start moving and implementing something, we'll never get them. And so our hope is to, A, position ourselves for what is an amazing commercial opportunity, but B, create the discussion at a policy level that will hopefully allow us to capitalize on that opportunity. And yeah, I've stuck on this slide, but the rest were pretty evident anyway. There we go. So that's me wrapped up in a record 4 minutes.
Thank you so much, Alex, for your efforts. And I think your main messages were really clear. Also in the chat, there are some congratulations there on both, it's a great commercial opportunity, as you said, but there's also great interest in the learning opportunity as well. And with that, I would like to thank all of our panelists today for providing us with a great learning opportunity and gaining from your experience and your analysis. And with that, over to you, Ian, to take us to the break.
Yeah, thank you so much, Long Seng. And yes, please, also my thanks to all the panelists. Really interesting discussion, and the chat's been fantastic too. Obviously, we're not quite on schedule, but I still think we need a bit of a break. I've got a lot to think about and digest. So could I suggest we come back in around 4 minutes or so, 4 to 5 minutes for the final session? Please do hang around. We've got some work for you to do. How we'll proceed is we'll start with some very quick discussion points from a range of our speakers on an action agenda going forward, and then it'll be off to Padlet. We want to get your thoughts around priorities on mobility options, on the types of studies and other activities we need to do, and implementation. So see you in about 4 minutes or so. Many thanks. Okay, hi everyone. Hopefully you've had a chance to grab a cup of tea and you're ready to go for the final session of this workshop. And this session is devoted to really getting your thoughts, ideas, priorities, and interest in participating in various parts, possibilities, concept notes in developing an action agenda to progress land transport resilience. And as the presentations have all highlighted, there's lots of challenges. There's a lot going on, but there's a real need for thinking through the way that we actually take this forward. And of course, particularly with FESRIP, looking at a regional or sub-regional set of perspectives on how we might do that. So there's really a couple of things that we need to do in this session. One of them is, I thought it'd be really valuable to quickly just get some of the people who've presented back to speak very quickly, just 1 or 2 minutes, giving their perspectives on some of these challenges, opportunities and priorities. And obviously these people aren't speaking for their organisations. These are perspectives in a personal capacity. Perhaps they will have perspectives that are organisational. But it'd be really great to get their views on what they sort of see around some of the key things in taking forward and bringing actions through. So look, Jeanette and David, if you are still both online, would you like to turn on your cameras and unmute your microphones? And we just welcome some quick thoughts on ways forward.
Thank you very much, Ian. So probably I'll just go first. Just in terms of policy and governance, and like we had mentioned, that a well-defined strategy is definitely what we see as essential at this point in time as well. But just also thinking about our targets, the whole policies that we have set, and really it has been difficult for us to really realize this on the ground. And then we're trying to think about what are the kinds of radical change that can be brought about. For example, if we do a complete ban on import of fossil fuel vehicles, let's say by the year 2040 or 2045, would something like that spur the kind of intention to get many of these things moving at pace? So it's just those kinds of thinking and discussion, perhaps, what would be public response like, and how do we determine all those time frames? But these are the kind of challenges. Sometimes it becomes kind of on our part just to set policies, but really to realize the impact that it has, that has been lacking. And even from our fiscal incentives that we have currently with regards to charging stations and electric vehicles, but the uptake has been minimal, and which is not very it doesn't really make much difference in terms of what we are trying to do. So really it's a challenge for us in terms of how do we really connect the dots here. Thanks. I'll stop here and hand over to Devjit should he have something to add on.
Devjit, would you like to add any quick thoughts?
No quick thoughts as of now. Yeah, thank you.
No worries. Thanks very much. Okay, Pamela, anything you'd like to add with a funding perspective hat on? Okay, Pamela, are you there? We may have lost her. Okay, well, look, we can come back to that. One thing we haven't had so far is a bit of a utility perspective. And Abraham Simpson, who wears a number of hats, but one of those is his role with the Pacific Power Association. Abraham, would you like to jump in and just give some quick thoughts around challenges, opportunities and priorities with a utility perspective on?
Yeah, thank you. Ian, just quickly, as I looked at the forecast from GGGI, I had been made aware of it a few days ago. I did some quick calculations, just based on back of the envelope and from my experience, both in the land transport and in the grid operation. If we're going to make up the gap by 2050, we're going to require over 2,000 megawatts of solar panel installation if we're just going to make that, bridge that gap by solar panels. And that's, I think, is just a, over 2,000 megawatts. That's over 2,000 square kilometers of land. That's about, in the next 30 years, about 67 megawatts per year. And EFL is just awarding their first 5 megawatt scheme. I mean, that's the kind of challenge. Now you may say go off grid, but you still got to invest in that capacity. And then augmenting the transmission capacity and distribution line capacities to cater for all this energy is going to be added on top of that. And then storage, battery storage, maybe the hydro can be a long-term storage. If you operate it, it can become a way of storing energy. So it's going to be a huge challenge. Now, if you want to use hydro, you need about over 400 megawatts of hydro capacity installed. I remember in 2001 flying in a helicopter along the Bar River and Singatoka River, trying to locate options for dams and power stations for the Nandarvatu scheme. I think that was commissioned 2009 or 2010, almost 10 years from initial survey to commissioning. I think last year, last night, the Tina Hydro scheme, we're told it went from concept to financial closure 10 years, and they still yet to do. So if you go the hydro way, you're not going to do that in 30 years. If you go by the pass, one every 10 years, that means you're going to have 3 schemes. And from my knowledge, it's not. So I say it's going to be a huge challenge if we try and bring all that land transport energy onto the grid. And I don't think many of the utilities understand that yet. And I don't think many people know the impact of that. For me, it's something recently I've just come to realize. So that just tells you the challenge we have before us.
Thank you very much, Abraham. Solomone, if I think you're still around, would you care to make any sort of quick comments on your thoughts on priorities?
Yes, thanks, Ian. As with anything new, it will bring opportunities, and I think we have heard that from some of the presenters today. At the same time, as Abe has mentioned, there are, of course, challenges. We have heard the term readiness being mentioned by the presenters, and the fact that not one size fits all. And I think it raises the importance that people would need to do the analysis, collect the data, and I think this is where it highlights the role of universities in terms of conducting the research, and I must thank the USP as well as University of New South Wales for the excellent analysis and the research. Even the one by Eduardo, the 9 scenarios that he presented based on the Pacific Islands, and even though it's still indicative, but we need more of those because countries can only make informed decisions based on concrete evidence. And I think that's where the role of data and analysis comes in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Solomon. And last, and picking up on the university theme, Atul, would you like to provide any quick thoughts on ways forward before we go to the Padlet?
Thanks, Ian. I think it should be all sector approach. It cannot be done by one organization or one sector. It has to be everyone together in this. And research and development will be very, very important. And talking about the grid has to be, we're talking about smart grids now, and Peter Johnston has been talking about energy efficiency bit. So we have to make sure that energy efficiency becomes part of our, the grid structure. And so smart grids, energy efficiency, and then bringing in the EVs into the mix. So a lot of data, a lot of research is needed. And I think universities can do a lot of work in this. And it's not only in the EV sector, but hydrogen is coming in, how to get renewable hydrogen, green hydrogen. We can also talk about pumped hydro combined with solar. A lot of work is done by ANU, and they have done geospatial mapping. And Fiji has a lot of potential for pumped hydro. So we could investigate that. So we would not be running out, the intermittent problems with solar, but pumped hydro with solar, that could be one solution. So there are a lot of things that can be done in, research wise, but we have to work together with, the utilities, the universities, the climate change office, and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Atul. Now in the chat, I've put the link to the Padlet page, and it's really seeking your input as votes, but also comments and your interest in contributing to work in particular areas. A particular thing that Aquila has been flagging over these 3 workshop days has been how we can look for collaborations and people and organisations interested to work together on developing particular, perhaps concept notes for projects and programs. So please jump over to the Padlet. And please, we've got about 10 minutes or so. Aquila, I hope you don't mind if we just push a little bit later than the schedule. But I think it'd be great to get feedback from the 70+ people participating.
Not a problem, Ian. Please go ahead.
Fantastic. So please, let's see you over at the Padlet. So fantastic. We're seeing lots of votes, which is great. And but please also feel very free using the comments. If you click on the add comment, you can add a comment. If there's one of these things your organisation would be very keen to contribute towards and participate in, please feel free to just note that, and that will help Aquila and us and the team look to sort of try and build a path forward from here. Just one more comment. When you make a comment, you'll generally be flagged as anonymous. So if you're very happy to be identified with a view, just add your name. Okay, you've got about another 5 minutes, so please keep working away. Okay, so just another 2 or 3 minutes to go, and then we'll jump back into the Zoom session. So grab this chance to get your final thoughts. Okay, just 1 more minute to contribute your thoughts, and then back to Zoom. Okay, fantastic. Just a couple of things. Pamela did message me to say that she'd been having some internet problems, so she does apologise that she wasn't able to contribute some thoughts in that early pre-discussion. Also, we're going to keep the Padlet open. So if you have this link, keep it open on your browser and you want to just think a little bit more about it or, you know, add thoughts, we'd really welcome you to do that over the next couple of days. And
how do you actually put a name on? Because you try to do it, it's particularly once you've done the comment, it's not very clear how to do it.
Yeah, look, Simon, it's I believe you have to have a Padlet account formally to be automatically named. So the best thing is with your comment just to put your name down in the comment.
Oh, in the comment.
Yeah, that's what we've found so far. So and you feel free to be anonymous, but also feel free to put your name down, particularly if you're interested in putting your hand up.
Okay. Right. Yep.
Look, given the time, I think it's now time to pass over to Aquila, who has the job of trying to summarize not only today, but 3 days of workshops and the way forward. So please, Aquila, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Yeah, okay. My main talking points. I would first of all, I would like to I'll be very short. I would like to recall 2 important decisions taken by the energy ministers during the 4th Pacific Regional Energy and Transport Ministers meeting that was held in Apia, Samoa in 2019. The first one is the ministers endorsed the development of a new regional energy framework to be a regional vehicle for an accelerated progress on the SDGs, Samoa Pathway, nationally determined contributions, and energy roadmaps, and the need for the new energy framework to be supportive of the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. And the second decision is the minister have requested SPC through the Pacific Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, PICRE, UNIDO, and the Small Island Developing States, SIDS, Energy Transformation Initiative, or what is known as SIDSDOC, to develop a regional policy document and program and promote SIDS cooperation and exchange on integrated e-mobility and renewable energy power systems. So everyone will benefit from strengthening our collaboration and coordination of activities and to fulfill the 2 energy ministers' decisions that I have mentioned above. Greater synergies will emanate from our joint efforts and partnerships from the outset in the implementation of the FESRIP 2021 to 2030. SPC, as the lead energy agency in the region, is relying on all PICTs and partners to enhance our collaboration and coordination of efforts. There will always be teething problems and drawbacks along the way, but with our commitment, we can manage those as we progress. We are all here for one important purpose, and that is to assist and support the PICTs in their energy transformation and greenhouse gas emission reduction, which will ultimately contribute to economic prosperity and raising the living standards of the Pacific people. We may disagree on how to get there or how this bigger vision can be achieved, but I'm sure many of you would agree that we all want to contribute to achieving that common goal. I sincerely hope that we are not going to lose sight of that. On the next steps, again, if your organization is interested to be part of any concept note development or project proposal development, please send us an email if you haven't done so in the Padlet survey today and in the last 2 days. Secondly, if you wish to be a co-lead in any of those project proposals, please let us know as well. We will collate all the information and the Padlet survey data and get back to you in the next 2 weeks. SPC in collaboration with crop agencies will coordinate all concept notes project proposal development. And regarding the coordination of progress against energy targets, we will be reaching out to all the PICTs and partners on an annual basis to do a stock take of what you have done for your ongoing activities for the current year and your planned activities for the following year. To start this coordination process, we will reach out to all PICTs and partners before the end of this year, and we will request your assistance for the stock take of what you have done for this year and your ongoing activities, as well as your planned activities for 2022. This will allow SPC and the relevant partners to track progress against targets on an annual basis and report back to the countries, as well as to the Energy Ministers meeting. And the 5th Energy Ministers meeting is scheduled to be held in Vanuatu in 2022. Thank you very much, all participants and all speakers. I now hand over to Ian and Abraham for the closing remarks. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Aquila. And I think it should now be clear to you all that Aquila has plans for you and some work for you to do. Just on logistics following up this workshop, obviously Aquila's outlined outreach SPC's doing. The presentations will be made available. We've already seen various people requesting those, and we will obviously be looking to summarise outcomes as we go forward. But we thought the final word should go to Abraham Simpson. So Abraham, please.
Thank you, Ian. I was asked to deliver this closing address on behalf of the acting Managing Director of the Pacific Power Association, a crop agency with SPC. So distinguished delegates, government officials, development partners, members of the academia, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of SPC and its crop agencies, I wish to thank all delegates who have participated in this workshop to address the priorities set out in the Framework for Energy Security and Resilience in the Pacific, or FESCRIP. Over the last 3 evenings, especially those who have stayed up at odd hours of the night. To the organizers of this workshop, led by SPC, SPREP, PPA, IRENA, USP, University of Papua New Guinea, Ogbara University, and the University of New South Wales, thank you for all the hard work put into organizing this workshop. Your efforts are appreciated, and it shows out in the success of this workshop. The challenges of implementing these priorities have just begun. We must ever keep in mind that we cannot afford to fail. The consequences of failure are too serious for our people. The ultimate goal will only be realized years from now, but along the way, there shall be milestones that we can celebrate, of which the success of this workshop is but the first. The challenge is so huge, it will take a united effort among governments, coordinated through SPC and its crop agencies, development partners, academia, NGOs, and other stakeholders to successfully implement FESCRIP. Thanks to all those who put forward their interest in helping to prepare the concept notes. That's just the next step in this long journey. The workshop is a call to arms, the start of a journey towards a cleaner, greener Pacific, where the skies will remain blue above us and the sun continues to shine on our golden beaches and surrounding turquoise waters. So once again, thank you to all, and Vinakavaglevo.
Thank you so much, Abraham. And, a long journey ahead, but it does start with a step. So, okay, look, I think our work is done. Again, thanks. Again, please feel free to continue contributing on the Padlet or reaching out directly to any one of us. And thank you all so much for many of you, 3 days of your time, well into the evening. We are so appreciative of everything that you've done, sharing your very valuable time, thoughts, ideas, and interests with us. Okay, goodbye, everyone, and have a good evening or a good night or a good morning, Longsang.
Bye-bye,
Goodbye.
everyone.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot,
Take care,
Ian.
bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Night all.
Goodbye. Good
Bye-bye.
night. Good morning.
Goodbye.
Good afternoon.
Good night. Good night.
Good
Bye.
afternoon, good morning, and see you
Good
some other
morning.
time.
Good morning, Kalim. I gone to sleep.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Night.